So the epoxy on my hood has finally dried up enough that I could sand it. And off camera, I took a little bit of effort and sanded this down. So you can see, I've been able to get it pretty much even to the rest of the hood. So I'm gonna go ahead and follow the rest of the process on the other places where I have excess epoxy built up. And all I'm really gonna be doing is, I'm gonna start off with a 180 grit paper, then migrate to 220 and keep going successively until I get up to 1500 grit, which is what I did here. And that should leave me with a nice even finish that matches the rest of the hood. And once I'm done with that, I'll finally be able to move on to clear coating the hood. So for this part of the hood, I'm gonna be using a small piece of wood as a sanding block, and that's gonna help to make sure that I get a nice flat, even finish as I'm doing this. All right, so let's start working on this. Wet the surface, and we'll wet the sandpaper. You can already see that it's starting to flatten out. Now approach it from the edges so that I can start wearing the edges down. At this point, I've reduced it quite a bit, so I'm going to go ahead and move up to the 220 grit. That's going to finish evening it out. Basically making the edges of this blob disappear. So at this point, there's basically no visible transition. I can still slightly feel it, so I'm going to give it a little bit of love just till I can't feel it with my fingers. pretty even, so I'm gonna move up to the next grit. Having sanded the epoxy up to a 1500 grit, now you can see that the epoxy is completely even all the way across, and you can see that my holes are filled in. With the epoxy all evened out, I'm going to go ahead and give the hood a final rinse and then one final sanding down over the entire surface with, I originally intended 1500 grit, but unfortunately I'm out, so I'm going to have to go to 2000 grit. It doesn't really matter, the clear coat will probably still stick just fine, so I'm just going to go ahead, clean it, and sand it down. So at this point I need to glue on the mesh that's going to go in the vent, and for that purpose I have some plastic bonding epoxy. I've got my mesh already pre-cut, and I've got a few weights here, some old rusty weights that I'm going to use to weigh it down and make sure that it presses down evenly so that it glues down the way that it needs to. Also placed a piece of cardboard here underneath the hood so that any epoxy that makes its way over the edge won't fall into my table. Now, I'm thinking it may be difficult to spread epoxy throughout all of this, having mixed it off to the side. So I may try laying it here and then mixing it here. But let's see how that works. See if that goes well for me or not before I fully commit to it. This stuff has a 15-minute working time. Oh crap. Already this is looking like a disaster. All right, so I'm just coming back in and putting epoxy in from the top, and then I'm going to put the weights back down. So having added extra epoxy and put the weights back down on the hood, I'm just going to wait a few hours, and then I'm going to take all of the weights and the pieces of wood off, and hopefully this should be attached properly. All right, it's been a couple hours, so I'm going to go ahead and start taking off the weights. Stuff is fairly dry. Probably still not cured like all the way through, but it's dry enough that I can take the weights off. I don't need to worry about it coming apart. So I'll probably come back in and just spray all this black from the back just so that I won't have this yellow stuff on the bottom of my hood. But I'm pretty happy with this so far. Let's turn it around and see what it looks like. Looking at this, I can see a couple of imperfections, things that I could have done better, but I'm not particularly concerned. I can break off these little bits of epoxy that flow through, and then any damage that's left, I can pretty much sand through it without too much of an issue. Looks like this material isn't even thoroughly dry here. Let's go ahead and wipe it off. It's possible that that was a little bit of epoxy that didn't have enough hardener in it. Can't say that for this stuff here, but that's okay. Come in with a Dremel and clean that up. Take an X-Acto knife and just remove some of this epoxy. The rest I can sand down. So that's about as far as I'm going to be able to get for this video. Stay tuned for the next video to see how I'm going to go ahead and clear coat this. If you like this video, if you enjoyed it, please feel free to like, subscribe, and click the notification bell so that you're notified whenever I post a new video. If you have any feedback or ways that I can improve on this, feel free to leave that in the comments. And as always, thank you for watching.